Buckle up because this is a story I never thought I'd have to share. My husband, let's call him Ethan, has had a complicated history with his parents. They disowned him over a decade ago, and now they've made a dramatic reappearance in our lives, for all the wrong reasons. This is a wild ride, so let's dive into the details. Ethan grew up in a strict household under the thumb of his parents, Carl and Linda. They were immigrants who worked tirelessly to create a stable life for themselves, and naturally they wanted Ethan, their only child, to achieve even more. Carl and Linda's dreams were steeped in traditional success. Doctor, lawyer, engineer, you know the drill. But Ethan had other plans. His passion was ballet, a love he discovered as a child when Carl and Linda's busy schedules meant he spent afternoons at his Aunt Joanne's dance studio. Joanne was a professional dance instructor, and Ethan absorbed every move like a sponge. At first, his parents didn't mind. They even enjoyed the occasional dinner funded by his prize money from small competitions. But when Ethan decided to pursue dance professionally, all hell broke loose. Carl and Linda viewed it as a betrayal, a waste of their sacrifices and the expensive private education they'd provided. Their disapproval went from subtle jabs to outright hostility when Ethan announced that he wasn't just going to dance, he wanted to teach ballet. Carl's insults grew cruel, calling him soft, and accusing Joanne of planting ridiculous ideas in his head. By the time Ethan was 18, the tension was unbearable. He left home, working multiple jobs to fund his education at a prestigious dance academy. I met Ethan a few years later when he taught a summer ballet class at my college. He wasn't just talented, he was magnetic. His movements told stories, and I found myself switching batches just to attend his classes. One thing led to another, and by the end of summer, we were inseparable. Ethan was always upfront about his estranged relationship with his parents. They had cut him off entirely by the time he was 22, refusing to attend his performances or acknowledge his achievements. It crushed him, but he channeled that pain into his art. After a few years of dating, we got married in a small, intimate ceremony. Ethan's parents weren't there, of course. He had built a life without them, and though the scars lingered, he was proud of his independence. Life wasn't easy at first. Living in the heart of a bustling city drained us financially, and there were times when dinner was nothing more than bagels and instant noodles. That's when we decided to make a change. We moved to a quiet town where Ethan could finally realize his dream of opening his own dance school. It started small. We converted our garage into a studio and relied on word of mouth to attract students. Slowly but surely, it grew. Ethan's talent and charisma drew people in, and within a few years, we were living the life we had only dreamed of before. A cozy house, a reliable car, and a fridge stocked with more than just leftovers. A year ago, Ethan took a big leap and bought an abandoned factory, transforming it into a vibrant dance academy offering a range of styles. We even bought a small summer home by the lake, a retreat we'd earned through years of hustle and sacrifice. Life was finally good. And then they showed up. Out of nowhere, Carl and Linda appeared on our doorstep looking frail and remorseful. They claimed they wanted to reconcile, to mend the fractured bond that had kept them apart from their son for so long. They cried, apologized, and insisted they couldn't bear the guilt of their past actions. Ethan was stunned. For years he had longed for his parents' approval, and here they were, seemingly contrite. But something about the timing felt off. Why now? Why, after all these years, had they decided to make amends? I stayed quiet while they made their case, but my gut told me this wasn't about love. It was about something else. I didn't want to influence Ethan, so I told him it was his decision whether or not to let them back into his life. And that's where things started to unravel. Ethan's optimism got the better of him, like it always does. Despite everything, he decided to give his parents a chance. He told me that maybe they had changed, and that people could grow with time. I wanted to believe that too, but something in their sudden appearance still didn't sit right with me. Carl and Linda started inviting us over for dinners, trying to play the part of loving parents who'd seen the error of their ways. Ethan was hesitant at first, but I could tell he wanted to believe in their sincerity. Our first dinner at their house was awkward. Ethan mostly stuck to polite small talk, and I just tried to make sure the conversation didn't derail into past grievances. Carl and Linda showered Ethan with compliments, acting like proud parents seeing their child succeed for the first time. But the cracks in the facade weren't hard to spot. They were too eager, too over the top in their praise, like they were trying to sell a story. They never once asked about our struggles or how we got to where we were. It was all about Ethan's success and how proud they suddenly were of his achievements. After a few more visits, Ethan seemed lighter. He wasn't fully convinced, but at least they were trying, or so he thought. I, on the other hand, couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about mending fences. I started noticing little things. The way Carl would bring up Ethan's business, asking about profits and the property we'd bought, or how Linda casually mentioned their financial troubles but quickly brushed it off as not a big deal. It all came to a head one night when Linda had a bit too much wine. She started talking about their financial problems in more detail, letting slip that they were in serious debt. Their business had failed, and they were on the verge of losing their home. Ethan and I exchanged a look, the kind that says, "This is what we were waiting for." Ethan asked her directly if they needed money. Linda tried to backtrack, insisting that their intentions were pure and that they just wanted their son back in their lives. "Honey," she said, "we're not here for money. We just love you. That's all." Ethan, always hopeful, took her at her word. But I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in my gut. A week later, Carl called Ethan to meet privately. Ethan, thinking it was just another step toward rebuilding their relationship, agreed. What Carl said during that meeting shattered any illusions Ethan had left. Carl didn't beat around the bush. He told Ethan that they wanted a share of his property, specifically our summer home, and a monthly allowance of $5,000 to help them get back on their feet. He even tried to justify it by saying that since Ethan and I didn't have kids, we didn't need all this money or property for ourselves. Ethan was devastated. For years, he had secretly held on to the hope that his parents might one day see him for who he was and that they might accept him without strings attached. And here they were, not even trying to hide their motives anymore. He asked Carl why they hadn't come to him when he was at his lowest, struggling to make ends meet while building his career. Carl's response? "Because you needed to learn your lesson. You chose this ridiculous career and you abandoned the family. We wanted you to come crawling back." Ethan came home that night a different person. He was quiet, his usual spark dimmed. I didn't need to ask what happened. His face said it all. When Linda showed up the next day, she tried to smooth things over, blaming Carl's outburst on stress and high blood pressure. She begged Ethan to reconsider, saying they were desperate and had nowhere else to turn. Ethan, though hurt, still couldn't completely turn his back on them. They were his parents, after all, and he couldn't imagine letting them end up homeless. But the more we dug into their financial situation, the less sense it made. Their home, which they claimed was in foreclosure, was actually fully paid off. Their business wasn't failing because of debt. They were selling it off and planning to use the money for a world trip. It became clear that they weren't desperate. They were opportunistic. They saw Ethan's success as a safety net, a way to live comfortably without having to downsize their lifestyle. Ethan confronted them again, this time armed with everything we'd uncovered. Carl denied the world trip rumors, calling it none of our business, and doubled down on his claim that Ethan owed them as their son. That was the last straw. Ethan told them they weren't getting a dime, and he cut them off completely. But the story doesn't end there. Oh no, not even close. You'd think being told no would make Carl and Linda back off, but they only saw it as a challenge. For people so obsessed with pride, they had no problem stooping to new lows. It started small. Phone calls at all hours, guilt-tripping Ethan with lines like, "We raised you, sacrificed everything for you, and this is how you repay us?" Linda's voice would crack with crocodile tears, saying things like, "I'm your mother, Ethan. How can you let me suffer like this?" But Ethan had had enough. For the first time, he stood his ground, calmly but firmly telling them that their behavior was unacceptable. He even offered to help in small ways, like investing in a modest venture they could manage, but only if they dropped their demands for our property and monthly allowance. They didn't take it well. Carl, in his usual bluntness, said Ethan owed them more than just scraps. He argued that because we didn't have kids, all our success should naturally flow back to the family, meaning him and Linda. He made it sound like we were sitting on mountains of cash when the truth was we'd only just started to feel financially comfortable after years of struggle. Then came the bombshell. They weren't just asking anymore, they started demanding. Carl boldly claimed that as Ethan's parents, they had a right to a share of our property and earnings. It wasn't even a request at that point, it was a statement. When Ethan stood firm, refusing to budge, Carl and Linda escalated. They started showing up unannounced at our dance school. At first, it was under the guise of dropping by, but soon it turned into disruptions during classes. They would stand outside, glaring through the windows or attempting to strike up conversations with students and parents. Then came the rumors. Out of sheer spite, they began spreading lies about us. They told anyone who would listen that we were physically abusive to the young students at the academy. It was beyond anything I could have imagined. Ethan was shattered. His reputation, something he'd worked tirelessly to build, was under attack by the very people who were supposed to protect him. We tried to keep our heads down, hoping they'd tire themselves out. But they didn't. They doubled down, showing up with flyers accusing us of horrible things and handing them out around town. I couldn't believe how far they were willing to go just because Ethan had refused to give in to their entitled demands. That's when we realized we couldn't handle this alone anymore. We reached out to a lawyer who assured us that their claims of entitlement to Ethan's assets were baseless. But the defamation? That was a different story. We filed a formal complaint against them, citing harassment and defamation. The next time they showed up at the school, we called the cops. I'll never forget the scene. Carl yelling about how he'd spent a fortune raising Ethan and was simply collecting his dues, while Linda sobbed about how we were ungrateful. The officers, clearly unimpressed, told them to leave and warned them that their behavior could lead to serious legal consequences. Carl, of course, wasn't having it. He sneered at the officers and declared that family matters were none of their business. One officer, barely holding back a laugh, told him, "If it's none of our business, stop making it everyone else's business with your flyers. We thought that might be the end of it." Spoiler, it wasn't. Despite the police warning, they didn't stop. They started camping outside our home and dance school, holding up signs with vague accusations like, "Frauds live here" and "Justice for parents." When the cops came again, Carl argued that he wasn't naming anyone specifically, so technically it wasn't defamation. Our lawyer suggested getting a restraining order, which we did. That helped for a while, but then Carl and Linda switched tactics again. They filed a lawsuit against Ethan, claiming they were entitled to maintenance as his parents, since they'd invested in his upbringing. It was absurd. The legal system might have allowed them to file the case, but there was no merit to it. The case dragged on for months. Ethan was drained, both emotionally and creatively. Teaching dance became a struggle, so we hired additional teachers to lighten his load. I did my best to keep the business running while supporting him through the endless court hearings. It broke my heart to see the light in his eyes fade under the weight of his parents' betrayal. The courtroom became a stage for Carl and Linda's drama. They played the role of elderly, loving parents who had been abandoned by their selfish son. At one point, Ethan even offered to give them a one-time payment to help them out, but they refused. Carl demanded $1 million. I nearly laughed out loud in disbelief. The judge, thankfully, wasn't buying any of it. After hearing the evidence, including years of estrangement and their clear lack of financial need, the case was dismissed. The judge saw right through their manipulative act, and for the first time in months, we felt a wave of relief. But Carl and Linda weren't done yet. As they stormed out of the courtroom, Carl shouted that he'd find another way to make Ethan pay. And that brings us to where we are now. Exhausted, but finally starting to rebuild. We've installed security cameras, reinforced the locks on our home and dance school, and are even considering renting out our summer home just to keep it off their radar. It's been 2 weeks since the court case ended and things have been quieter. Word around town is that Carl and Linda are now trying to buy back their house from the new owner, but the price has skyrocketed. I wish I could feel bad for them, but honestly, they brought this on themselves. For a couple of weeks after the court case, things seemed to settle down. Ethan and I finally started to feel like we could breathe again. The dance school was thriving, and we had new students enrolling every week. Ethan was slowly regaining his spark, throwing himself into his work to forget the chaos his parents had unleashed on us. But deep down, I knew it was too good to last. People like Carl and Linda don't just disappear. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a letter. It was addressed to Ethan, postmarked from a nearby town and signed by a lawyer representing his parents. They were threatening yet another legal battle, this time trying to claim emotional damages for being cut off from their son. I couldn't believe the audacity. Emotional damages? After everything they'd put Ethan through, they had the nerve to act like victims? The letter was full of exaggerated claims, painting Carl and Linda as elderly parents abandoned by a heartless son who refused to care for them. Ethan read the letter silently, his jaw tightening with every sentence. When he finished, he handed it to me and said, "Let them come. I'm done being scared." We contacted our lawyer, who reassured us that this latest stunt was just as baseless as the last one. Still, it was a stark reminder that Carl and Linda weren't going to let go of their delusional sense of entitlement. Not long after, they started showing up around town again. This time, they weren't outside our home or dance school. They were targeting our community. They began talking to neighbors, students' parents, and even local business owners, spreading more lies about us. They claimed Ethan had turned his back on them after they'd sacrificed everything for him. They painted him as ungrateful and greedy, twisting the narrative to make themselves look like victims. And while most people saw through their act, there were a few who started to ask questions. One parent, a longtime supporter of our school, pulled me aside after class one day and said, "I don't believe a word of it, but you might want to address this before it gets out of hand." It was frustrating. We had spent years building our reputation, and now we were being forced to defend ourselves against baseless accusations. Ethan tried to stay focused on his work, but I could see the stress creeping back into his posture, his movements less fluid, his energy depleted. Then came the flyers. Again. This time, Carl and Linda had printed glossy pamphlets with their version of events, complete with sob stories and accusations. They plastered them on community bulletin boards, handed them out at the grocery store, and even left a stack at the town library. It was beyond ridiculous, and the community started to get fed up. One of our neighbors, a retired teacher named Mrs. Johnson, caught Carl trying to post a flyer outside her garden club and tore it down in front of him. "Don't you have any shame?" she yelled. "Leave those kids alone!" But Carl and Linda didn't care about public opinion. They only cared about getting what they thought they were owed. The final straw came when they showed up at the summer home. It wasn't just an unexpected visit. It was a full-blown trespassing incident. They'd broken in while we were away, leaving behind a mess of empty food wrappers and cigarette butts. We only found out because the property manager called us, saying he'd seen two elderly people lurking around the property earlier in the week. When we arrived to check it out, we found a handwritten note on the kitchen counter. It read, "This is where we belong. You don't need it, but we do. Stop being selfish." Ethan was furious. He crumpled the note in his hand and said, "That's it. We're done playing nice." We called the police and filed a trespassing complaint. When the officers spoke to Carl and Linda, they didn't even deny it. Linda tried to play the sympathy card, saying, "We're old, and we needed a place to stay. It's not like we stole anything." The officers didn't buy it. They warned Carl and Linda to stay away from our properties, our business, and our lives. That night, Ethan and I sat down and had a long talk about what to do next. We decided to take every possible step to protect ourselves. We installed more security cameras, changed the locks on all our properties, and even hired a lawyer to help draft a more comprehensive restraining order. It was exhausting, both emotionally and financially, but we didn't see any other choice. Carl and Linda had crossed every line, and we couldn't risk them escalating even further. The good news? The community was rallying around us. Parents at the dance school offered their support, neighbors called to check in on us, and even Mrs. Johnson stopped by with a batch of cookies and some kind words. It reminded us that while Carl and Linda were loud and toxic, they were still in the minority. But the fight wasn't over. Not yet. The quiet didn't last. It never does with people like Carl and Linda. A few weeks after the summer home incident, we thought things had calmed down for good. Ethan was getting back into his groove, and the community's support had been a much-needed boost for both of us. But then, like clockwork, Carl and Linda reappeared. This time with a stunt so outrageous it felt like something out of a bad drama. One evening, as Ethan and I were wrapping up the day at the dance school, a police car pulled into the lot. My stomach sank. For a split second, I worried Carl and Linda had pulled another trespassing stunt, but this was worse. The officers had come to inform us of a new legal case filed by Carl and Linda. This time, they were claiming we'd emotionally abused them to the point of physical distress. They had filed for damages, to the tune of $500,000. I could barely believe what I was hearing. Emotional abuse? Physical distress? Ethan, the same man who had spent years hoping for their approval and who had bent over backward to help them, was now being accused of harming them? It felt like a cruel joke. But it wasn't. It was real, and we were being dragged into yet another legal nightmare. Our lawyer assured us the case had no real merit, just like their previous attempts. But that didn't mean it wasn't going to cost us time, energy, and money to defend ourselves. And worse, it gave Carl and Linda yet another excuse to insert themselves into our lives. The next few months were a whirlwind of court dates, paperwork, and endless frustration. Carl and Linda showed up to every hearing, putting on a pitiful display of exaggerated coughing and leaning heavily on canes they didn't actually need. Linda cried on cue, while Carl delivered dramatic monologues about their sacrifices as parents and how we'd abandoned them in their old age. Ethan kept his composure, but I could see how much it hurt him. Every time Carl and Linda spoke, it was like reopening an old wound. They didn't just want our money or property, they wanted to break him, to reduce him to the scared, uncertain boy who had left their house all those years ago. But Ethan wasn't that boy anymore. During one hearing, Ethan finally had a chance to speak. He stood up, looked his parents in the eye, and said, "You've spent your entire lives trying to control me. When I didn't fit into the box you wanted, you threw me away. And now you're back, not because you love me, but because you want what I've worked for. I'm done letting you manipulate me." The courtroom was silent. Even Carl and Linda didn't have a snappy comeback. The judge thankfully saw through their charade. The case was dismissed, and the judge warned Carl and Linda that any further baseless lawsuits would result in heavy penalties. That should have been the end of it. But, of course, it wasn't. Carl and Linda, furious over their loss, resorted to what can only be described as guerrilla tactics. They started showing up at random places Ethan and I frequented, the grocery store, the park, even a cafe we loved. They didn't say anything outright, but they'd sit nearby, staring us down like predators waiting for the right moment to pounce. We decided we couldn't take it anymore. Our lawyer helped us file for a permanent restraining order, and we hired private security to monitor the dance school. It wasn't cheap, but at this point it was about peace of mind. The restraining order was granted, and for the first time in months, we felt a small measure of relief. Carl and Linda were legally barred from contacting us, coming near our properties, or harassing us in any way. Since then, things have been quiet. Too quiet, if I'm being honest. Carl and Linda haven't made any moves, and part of me wonders if they're plotting something new. But I've decided not to live in fear anymore. Ethan and I are focusing on the future now. We've started the adoption process, something we'd put off for too long because of all the chaos. The dance school is thriving, and Ethan is finally finding joy in his art again. As for Carl and Linda, I hear through the grapevine that they're still trying to buy back their old house, but the price has skyrocketed beyond their reach. They've burnt every bridge they had, and now they're facing the consequences of their own greed. I wish I could say I feel bad for them, but I don't. They made their choices, and they have to live with them. Ethan and I, on the other hand, are moving forward. We've worked too hard to let them drag us down. If there's one thing I've learned from all this, it's that family isn't defined by blood. It's defined by love, respect, and mutual support. And sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is walk away from people who refuse to see that. So that's where we are now. We're finally free, or as free as we can be. Life isn't perfect, but it's ours, and that's all that matters. Thanks for sticking with me through this roller coaster of a story, Reddit. If there's one thing I hope you take away from this, it's that setting boundaries isn't cruel. Sometimes, it's the only way to protect yourself and the people you love. Story 2. Greetings to all female partnerships. We discuss the issues that individuals deal with on a daily basis. First, let's watch the video. Kay and I had been married for 4 years, using the initial to conceal our identity for the last 3 of those years. Together, we had a great existence. She was in the finance industry, and I worked for a software company. Therefore, we didn't worry about money and spent our time living life to the fullest before starting a family and getting married. The nicest thing about her was that she worked so hard. She consistently put her job first and made wise financial choices, which has also benefited me as her spouse. She is the sharpest lady I have ever met, and she has truly assisted me in escaping extremely difficult financial circumstances. She chose to give up her career and become a full-time housewife once we decided to have a child, until our child was old enough to at least look after himself for a while. That led me to the conclusion that she will never return to work, at least not for the next 9 years. Since I'm aware of how it functions for the children, we'll make sure to go around and twist Kay's words until you fall for it and agree to her requests, even if she never says things directly. And this time, that's what took place. She left her career to care for the baby and become a housewife. The fact that a family's income would be cut in half if she quit her work is what she couldn't comprehend. She pondered. We will still be able to maintain our previous standard of living if she resigns, which is absurd. Even though I made more money than she did, the extra pleasures were still covered by her earnings. She was furious because I wouldn't have to do her share of the hard labor when she departed the job. She was disappointed and constantly found fault with me when she realized that our lavish weekend vacations had been reduced to monthly middle-class vacations. I'm aware that cleaning the house is exhausting and that taking care of a young child requires additional effort and can occasionally be frustrating. She did, however, sign up for that. Before she decided to quit her work, I offered her an offer, which she turned down. She can keep going to work, I had informed her. We hire nannies, but she chose to be a mother and remain at home, so I don't think I'm to blame for any criticism she may have had. It's not as if I can't afford it either. However, I'd like to retire as soon as possible. Additionally, I would have to save money for our children's college and leave them an inheritance if we had any. I can't make my wife feel like she's from Beverly Hills by blowing everything up in one weekend. We continued arguing over the item she was anticipating, which was just plain absurd. 24 hours a day. It is my responsibility to provide her with the money she needs to put food on the table and to look after her and the infant. Furthermore, I would never give her money to purchase those pointless fancy bags that she and her pals would then flaunt on Instagram. She can do all that nonsense, find a job, and collect her money. However, she must abide by my regulations if she is going to be reliant on me for everything. Furthermore, nothing about this situation is oppressive. To be honest. I'm a guy, you see. I am responsible for it, and I can support myself to a certain degree with my money. I perform fairly well. However, I would need to attend to other essentials in my life first. Furthermore, I don't understand why she decided to resign from her position in the first place. When we started having the baby conversation, she suddenly lost her entire sense of self-reliance. Being a working mother is difficult, which is precisely why I volunteered to help her by paying for nannies and a maid. To enable me to spend my money, she only needed to labor to save some of hers. That's her call, though, as she dumped all of her hard work into thin air. I quote not mistreating her financially. She receives the amount I am able to contribute, and my monthly payment is contingent on the state of the market. Please refrain from accusing me of foolish things that I would never accomplish in my lifetime. However, we continued to battle to the very end. I mean, she was so far away from me. I came very close to caving in to her demands at one point. I declined her offer, though, because I wouldn't waste $10,000 on a bag simply because celebs use it. Here's where I could be somewhat mistaken. In front of her pals, whom I assumed to be friends, she asked me for my money. Similar to the authentic ones. Therefore, it would be okay for me to disclose my poor financial situation. However, it turns out that I should have just avoided assuming anything, being so forthcoming with them and making the announcement. After things became awkward, my wife fled and sobbed all the way home. How awful a husband I am for not purchasing anything she requested, and how I made her feel uncomfortable in front of her friends. She went on a tirade about me being a bad spouse, making care to undermine any logic in her statements. We were silent for the next 3 days, but on the 4th day, I noticed her looking through my phone and finding a few emails from my ex-girlfriend from 6 years prior that I still had. I was unaware that such emails were stored. I must have been emotional when I erased everything and chose to archive them rather than simply delete them in case anything changed. However, she located them. I was still in love with my ex-girlfriend, she began, and we were only together because I wanted to use her as a rebound. Then, somehow, she came to the conclusion that I was unfaithful to her. I was furious at the moment, and to make matters worse, she accused me of cheating on every woman I interacted with. It would be cheating, for instance, if I gave the woman a hug when I greeted her. It would be cheating if I had a crush on a famous person. I was shocked at the time that she didn't think it was cheating for me to breathe the same air as other ladies. I wanted to inquire, but I was certain that she would somehow twist it to mean that I was implicitly confessing to kissing another woman. She didn't calm down, which was all I wanted. She began to slam her head against the wall and become erratic. Because I didn't want to be harmed by any of her insane actions, I took our kid and fled outside because I was so afraid of her. When I got back the following day, she suggested that we get a divorce. She was there with her buddies, who were disparaging me in my own home, and they all departed as soon as they spotted me. I talked to my lawyer about getting a divorce since I was afraid of her, and I instructed him to obtain the divorce paperwork as quickly as possible. After a legal battle, she was granted custody of our child. My lowest point in life. However, because I was entitled to have him over on the weekends, I was fine with it. Though insufficient, it was still preferable than nothing. Although I didn't back out of my obligation to pay child support, having to lose my child was a huge disappointment. And the explanation is so very foolish. All right, the original post was this one. I have provided as much information as possible. Let's go on to the update. After everything, she gave birth to our child and we moved out. We had to get used to the new schedule, even if it was difficult. After 2 weeks, she contacted me in tears today, pleading with me to take her and our son back since they were already having difficulties. I have no problem taking my child, but I can't possibly take her back, and she and I will never be reunited regardless of how or what happens. The fact that she can't simply destroy my heart and trust and then reestablish it the following day has nothing to do with my ego. It, quote, absurd. When I investigated her logic, she has no money for food or nappies since she spent it all in clubs. She's just out of everything because her pals wouldn't aid her. The hotel where she stayed, the manner she used to party, the one having financial acumen. Now take a peek at her. Seeing someone who destroyed their own life on their own is really awful. Nobody else is at fault. She made the wrong choice, but it was her call. She is capable of becoming independent. I'll bring my son along. We still haven't completed the necessary paperwork, though. Hello once more. I was occupied at home and at work. It, quote, something of a problem because everything is just getting started. After demonstrating my wife's incapacity, we were granted custody again, and she pleaded with me to do so. However, I advised her to put in a lot of effort and suggested one of the movements she showed me. She occasionally attempts to get in touch. She and our mutuals were dumped by her buddies. For what reason? My mother looks after me when I'm at work, and I rented my entire house and moved in with her because she indicated I didn't want to get married again anytime soon. So yes, this will be the most effective. Everyone is delighted, even my son. My ex received what was rightfully hers. Guys, let's toast to the new year. Now when they become weary of this independent woman character, that's what they all do. They revert to being the victim of oppression. OPP, find someone better. Don't you think she deserves you? Being a housewife is acceptable. However, she was becoming a slothful gold digger. The nation where I was born was rather patriarchal. My dad has always been liberal, and I came to the United States when I was 12. But as a child, I saw some strange things. Before he married his present wife, Layla, my father was a great womanizer, had trophy girlfriends, and was quite affluent. Layla was married, had 2 children, and her husband owed him a significant amount of money when he first met her. He said that if my dad forgiven the amount, he may go out and hurt Layla. Layla was completely enamored by my dad's wealth and started talking about marriage right away, saying she would be the ideal wife. Such like playing dress-up with my mother's jewelry, giggling, touching objects, and strolling about the home. In the end, Dad left my mother for her Dot. He truly loves her, in my opinion. He was ecstatic all the time, even though I detest it and find it disgusting. Nevertheless, Layla pleaded with him to marry her. My long-term boyfriend and I recently became engaged. Since he's terrible at such things anyhow, and I was tired of waiting, I made the proposal Dot during our celebratory family supper. Layla was joking about how strange America is. What makes my proposal so unromantic? Blah, blah, blah. It wasn't just her, to be honest. My siblings were joining in. Stop, I said. I implored my father to stop her. It's okay, though, because my dad constantly acts like we treat Layla badly. Dot. At last, I told the table that Layla had pleaded with my father to marry her. Pleaded so much that he and everyone else were laughing at her. Therefore, she shouldn't be speaking. Layla broke down in tears and ran away. My dad screamed at me, saying that I don't know what I'm talking about and that nobody can force him to do anything. If he hadn't wanted to, he wouldn't have married her. Dot. Because she believes my future in-laws believe my dad didn't love her, Layla declined to return. Given that I am aware that her entire self-image revolves around being the ideal wife and having him love her, I may be a bit of an ass now. My dad still gets mad at me. I would ask Dad directly, how much did you spend on her then? Yes, he has valid reasons for not like her. But it appears that OP's father purchased a trophy bride. To make matters worse, Dad left his wife in order to enhance the buy. Yes, the OP may not like the wife, but the father's behavior is even more reprehensible. What was his wife's ultimate cost then? Layla was the reason NTA and her father left his mother for his wife and lover, OP. There was a man who owed money to the father of the OP. He proposed to OP his father and his wife, who desired to wed him. His father ended their connection. That includes the sold wife and 2 strained relationships. What the hell? When my parents divorced, my sister, who is now 26 years old, left my mother and me when she was about 15. When my mother was very sick, neither she nor my father were able to help us. They are thus strangers in my books. My sister attended the funeral, but she didn't even spend the night with me since I had to make all the arrangements. Aside from holidays, she had communicated with our mother once or twice a year. She sent her presents and made an unsuccessful attempt to patch things up with my mom when she was still living. She informed me that although she forgives her, she is still furious that she never paid her a visit or even mentioned how sick she was. She gave me the most of the money even though she knew she loved my sister. Since I was the only one who stayed with her and looked after her, I believe this to be fair. A few weeks ago, I received a call from my sister informing me of her impending marriage. She wanted me to visit her home so we could spend her final weeks together as a couple, but I had no idea she was engaged. Since I'm so lonely and would really like to be near my family, I went last week. Since I'm upset with my father for both recent and past incidents, she assured me that I wouldn't have to see him while I was there. She had prepared a room for me when I arrived, which I found to be incredibly lovely. However, my father stopped by 3 days ago and tried to talk to me about how my mother was controlling him, that he owed her nothing, and that I should move on from the past. My sister and I were having a good time together, so I chose to overlook my evident anger. She then informed me yesterday that she had paid for her wedding and honeymoon using the money our mother had left her, but she still hadn't paid for her dress or the caterer. She had run out of money. She showed me the outfit at a fitting an incredibly costly gown. Additionally, 200 persons will be catered for. It adds up to a ridiculous sum of money. She could receive assistance from someone else, and I told her I could afford it, but I wasn't sure because it's a lot of money. She became irritated with me and said, I have to do this because our mother's money is our money, and she would have given her more than the pitiful amount of money she left her if she had known she wanted all of this. Since they hadn't seen one another in around 11 years and she owed her nothing, I informed her that the money she left was reasonable and that she could have left no money at all. She told me that my mother should have moved on from it and called her a sensitive bitch. Yes, I told her that I didn't care about her wedding and that I wouldn't spend a single penny on it. She became very angry and yelled at me, accusing me of being unjust and supporting a deceased lady who is unable to move on from her past. After gathering my belongings, I departed and am currently waiting to return home tomorrow in a motel. Am I at fault for not donating the money, even though I know my mother was correct about what she left? Your sister has no interest in re-establishing a relationship with you, NTA. She wants her wedding to be paid for by you, not much more. Her treatment of your mother and your mother's reaction. And she doesn't care about any of that. She just notices that there is not enough money for the wedding. She wants it and you can afford it, Dot. She wouldn't have contacted you if she had the funds to cover the wedding herself. Hurry! Avoid going to the no-contact area on foot. That money is not your mother's money, NTA. I'm sorry for your loss. You own the money. In order to harass you, your sister deceived you into coming to visit Dot. Your father will surprise you with an unwelcome visit and get you to give her money for a wedding to a man you haven't even seen, I assume. Are you even invited to this wedding, for example? If you are, it makes no difference. You haven't owed her any money yet. She was aware of her wedding budget. She had always intended to overspend and con you into giving her more, in my opinion. My wife won child support after accusing me of infidelity. After 2 weeks, she calls me in tears and begs me to return my son.